All right, welcome back to FACNet's 2023 Access and Functional Needs Trainings. We're really grateful to have Tess Stanton, the training administrator for the Rocky Mountain ADA Center, joining us again for this training. Our topic today is the fundamentals of accessible communication. And if you have any questions during the presentation, please feel free to put them in the chat box as we go. You can take yourself off of mute if you don't want to use the chat. And we'll also have time reserved at the end for a longer period of Q&A and discussion. And with that, I'll hand things over to Tess.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I appreciate that great introduction. Welcome back, everyone. I'm so excited to be joining you today, again, to talk more about accessibility and the Americans with Disabilities Act. Again, my name is Tess Stanton. I'm the training administrator at the Rocky Mountain ADA Center, and I'm so pleased to be joining you all. So we always have to start out with this disclaimer. If you were at our last session last month, you're familiar with it, although it has changed slightly since last time. So information, materials, and/or technical assistance are intended solely as informal guidance and are neither a determination of your legal rights or responsibilities under the ADA, nor binding on any agency with enforcement responsibility under the ADA. The Rocky Mountain ADA Center, operated by the University of Northern Colorado, is funded under a grant from the National Institute on Disability, Independent Living, and Rehabilitation Research, NIDLR grant number 90 DPAD 0014, to provide technical assistance, training, and materials to Colorado, Utah, Montana, North Dakota, South Dakota, and Wyoming on the Americans with Disabilities Act. So you may notice that if you're, incredibly attentive, our disclaimer has changed a little bit. We recently transitioned to be operated under the University of Northern Colorado, which we are incredibly excited about. And for any folks who weren't able to join us last time, I just kind of wanted to give a little overview of who we are and what we do at the Rocky Mountain ADA Center, just in case you can use this as a resource. So the Rocky Mountain ADA Center is part of the ADA National Network. And what the ADA National Network is, or the ADA-NN, is it's a series of centers throughout the United States that provide education, training, informal guidance, technical assistance, and materials on the Americans with Disabilities Act to individuals who want to know more about their rights under the ADA and organizations who want to know more about their responsibilities under the ADA. So the Rocky Mountain ADA Center, which I'm a part of, we serve Region 8, which consists of Colorado, Utah, Wyoming, North Dakota, South Dakota, and Montana. And I think I covered all of them. But there are ADA centers throughout the entire country. So even if you're outside of our region, if you're within the United States, you do have a local ADA center. And to get in touch with your local ADA center, all you have to do is call 1-800-949-4232, and you'll be routed to your local ADA center based on the area code of the phone number that you're calling from. Or you can go online to www.adata.org, and you can find your local ADA center's website through that larger website. The adata.org is the website for the national network, and then they have links to all of the individual centers throughout the country as well. So a little bit about what we do at the Rocky Mountain ADA Center, and you'll find that the services of the other ADA centers throughout the country are very similar. So our biggest service is we provide technical assistance. That's a free service, and what that is people can call or submit inquiries online. Our direct website is rockymountainada.org, or like I said, you could find the websites of the other ADA centers through adata.org, and so you can call or you can submit an inquiry online and just ask a question about the ADA. If you're in a situation where you're not sure how the ADA applies, or you know the ADA applies, but you just need to talk it through with a human rather than just relying on what the law says through Google, that's what we're here for. So that is a free service. It's completely confidential. So you can rest assured that if you call us or you submit an inquiry, we're not going to, come knocking on your door the next day with a measuring stick and say, you're not compliant. That's a confidential essential service. So we're just here to provide that informal guidance, that technical assistance. We're not lawyers. We don't claim to be lawyers. We don't claim to give legal advice. We don't give legal advice. We just give education and informal guidance. But again, that technical assistance service, that's a free service where you can actually get in touch with a real human and talk through your situation and how the ADA applies. And we are not an enforcement agency. Like I mentioned earlier, we don't enforce the ADA. We don't, submit complaints on the behalf of individuals. However, there are agencies that do enforce the ADA, and we'll go over those in just a minute here. But if you do have to take your situation to that level of enforcement, we're not able to intervene, but we can refer you to where you need to go to be able to do that and to get the help you need to take it to that level of enforcement. We also conduct research. We provide low-cost training, which is exactly what we're doing right now. We publish and share materials. So if you go to RockyMountainADA.org, you can find a whole online catalog of free online trainings that are individual, they're self-paced, and they should be available to anyone, even if you're outside of our region. So if you want to engage in a little more learning outside of these sessions, you can do that for free online and you'll receive a certificate. We also have a blog, we have a podcast, and we share materials through our social media. We're active on most social media platforms, so you can follow along with us or connect with us on there. And so now diving into our topic for today, we're going to understand the effective communication requirements under the ADA. We're going to discuss auxiliary aids and services that facilitate effective communication, and we're going to learn best practices for making digital content accessible. And as we go along, please feel free to ask questions. I do have the chat box open and I will monitor that as best I can, or we should have time for questions at the end. If you ever want to connect with us offline, please do that. We're here to take your questions. So again, you can use that contact information in the previous slide, or I'll provide the contact information again at the end of this training. If you want to ask us a question offline, or maybe a question arises after this training, we're here for that as well. Or if you're just more comfortable unmuting yourself during this session and asking a question or chiming in, please feel free to do that as well. Or of course, if at any point my slides go a little faulty, if you start to see the presenter view rather than at full screen, if you're unable to see me or hear me, please feel free to unmute yourself and let me know, because sometimes I don't always know that's happening and I need someone to kind of chime in and let me know of that. Also, I'll make sure that Tiernan receives a copy of these slides for distribution, so don't feel like you have to memorize all of this. You'll have these slides as a resource, as well as all of the videos and all of the resources and websites that are linked within the slides, which is many for this particular training. All right, so now let's go ahead and just do a little refresh of what the Americans with Disabilities Act, or the ADA, is. So the ADA is a civil rights law, and what that means is it's a legal guarantee of equal opportunity in areas of public life for individuals with disabilities. It's divided into 5 titles, and those different titles between them protect individuals with disabilities in areas of public life, employment, state and local government services, private businesses that serve the public, telecommunications, and so on. So it prohibits discrimination in areas of public life and ensures equal opportunity for individuals with disabilities in America, just as other individuals without disabilities have those opportunities. We always like to explain that it is descriptive rather than prescriptive. And what that means is it does not prescribe exactly what to do in every single situation, because every situation is so different, but rather the ADA generally describes what non-discrimination should look like. So as we talked about in the last session, the ADA is not a one size fits all. It's very much case by case. And I know that can cause some confusion. I have those words, "it depends" on the screen, because oftentimes when you're asking a question about the ADA, you're going to be met with the words "it depends," because how the law applies very much depends on the entities, the individuals, the circumstances. There's so many exceptions under the ADA. So it's all going to depend on the details of the situation, which again, that can get confusing confusing. That can get, there's a lot of gray area to be left there. And that's why your ADA centers are here, is so that you can receive that help when you're not sure how your circumstance, communicates with the ADA and meshes with the ADA and vice versa. So that's just a little refresh of the ADA, and that it is a civil rights law that covers areas of public life in America and prohibits discrimination against individuals with disabilities. As we talked about in the last session, individuals with disabilities is a very, very large population, and the definition of disability is a person with a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities, or folks who have a record of such an impairment and could be discriminated against, or folks who are regarded as having such an impairment and are discriminated against. So that's a very broad definition. And again, that's going to cover a lot of people in America. And so, as I mentioned, the ADA is divided into 5 titles, and you can think of these as sections of the ADA. And depending on, where you're coming from, who you're working for, what kind of work you're doing, how your work is funded, you may fall under multiple titles of the ADA. So these different titles are: Title I is the title that's designed to help people with disabilities access the same employment opportunities and benefits as people without disabilities. So this portion of the law is regulated and enforced by the Equal Employment Opportunity Commissions. So most employers with 15 or more employees and state and local governments of any size must comply with Title I and ensure that they're not discriminating against prospective or current employees in all areas of employment based on disability. Title II of the ADA prohibits discrimination against qualified individuals with disabilities in all programs, activities, and services of public entities. So it applies to all state and local governments, their departments and agencies, and other instrumentalities or special purpose districts of state or local government. So you can kind of think of this as anything that's, a state program or a state service or a local program or local service that's state funded has these Title II obligations. Then you can think of Title III as kind of your more everyday places of business, like your grocery stores, your restaurants, your social services, your laundromats, your hotels, places like that. Those private businesses that serve the public fall under Title III. And this includes both for-profit and nonprofit businesses. And so what Title III does is, again, it prohibits discrimination on the basis of disability in places of public accommodation. And again, places of public accommodation are going to be those private businesses that serve the public or commercial facilities. And then Title V covers telecommunications. So the reason we see, captions on our TV is very much thanks to Title IV of the ADA. And then finally, Title V is the miscellaneous provisions and kind of the catch-all, all the exceptions, how the law interacts with other laws, how the laws details of how it's enforced, exclusions under the ADA, things like that. So we're not going to worry too much about Title IV and Title V today. And we're also not really going to be spending a lot of time in Title I, but we're going to be spending more time in Title II and Title III. And your requirements, your obligations, your legal obligations of non-discrimination as a public service. So just again, to reiterate, Title I of the ADA is enforced by the U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. Titles II and III are enforced by the United States Department of Justice. And Title IV is enforced and regulated by the Federal Communications Commission, or the FCC. And the reason I include this is because these enforcement agencies are also going to be a really, really useful source when it comes to the ADA and learning more about the ADA or asking questions about the ADA. Again, we're kind of an informal guidance tool, but these enforcement agencies do also have contacts that you can get in touch with and ask questions or figure out how you're, in compliance or not. So just to be aware of, you can get in touch with these enforcement agencies or look up resources from them if you want more information or need to go looking for more information about the ADA. So now let's go ahead and move into what it means to provide effective communication. So we're going to start out with what effective communication is under the ADA. What is this requirement of effective communication that is explicitly put forth under the ADA? So this is kind of the big picture. This is kind of the broad requirement of what needs to happen under the ADA when it comes to communication. And then we'll kind of get into more detailed information of exactly what it looks like to, make your digital content accessible and the tips and tricks that you need to keep in mind. But first, we're going to start out with this big umbrella that is effective communication under the ADA. So people with disabilities that affect hearing, seeing, speaking, reading, writing, or understanding may use different ways to communicate. So for example, people who are blind may give and receive information audibly rather than, in writing, and deaf people may give and receive information through writing or sign language rather than through verbal speech or audibly. And so Title I and II entities under the ADA are required to provide effective communication. And so again, those Title II and III entities, those are going to be state and local government programs, services, agencies, et cetera. And those Title III entities are going to be those private businesses and commercial facilities that serve the public. So these places, which is most of the places we go in our daily lives when we're outside of our homes, are going to have this requirement to provide effective communication. And what effective communication essentially means is that the information you provide must be as clear and understandable to people with disabilities as it is for people who do not have disabilities. So making sure that this is possible often involves the use of auxiliary aids and services, but we'll talk about those more later. Entities, however, are generally not required to provide any auxiliary aid or service or perform any action that would either fundamentally alter the nature of the goods or services offered or result in an undue burden. So there are some exceptions to this rule of providing effective communication. The ADA does not say that you have to, make reasonable modifications or provide auxiliary aids and services as requested in every single circumstance. However, you really should always be making a good faith effort. But there are some instances where certain actions may be, extremely difficult or impossible or unreasonable, and the ADA does account for that. So let's explore these areas of exception a little bit more. So again, yes, there are some exceptions under the ADA when providing a certain auxiliary aid or service to facilitate effective communication is not always possible. One of these exceptions being when an action would result in an undue burden. An undue burden is defined as significant difficulty or expense. For Title II entities specifically, the determination that something would result in an undue burden can only be made by the head of a public entity or their designee, and it must be accompanied by a written statement of the reasons for reaching that conclusion. So in other words, Title II entities can't just say, sorry, that's an undue burden, and then wipe their hands and move on. There's a lot that has to kind of go into this process. So it's kind of a high bar to meet. And the determination that undue burdens would result must be based on all resources available for use in the program. So in other words, maybe your department doesn't have the resources for providing a particular auxiliary aid or service, but maybe the larger, umbrella company does have those resources. And so claiming undue burden, you have to be accounting for all the resources available, not just the resources of a certain department or a certain agency or, a certain subsection of an entity. So let's take an example of what undue burden might look like in action. Let's say that a resident of a city requests a sign language interpreter for a simple interaction at a city building. They walk in on the spot, they say, I want a sign language interpreter right now. But there was no interpreter at the site, and the clerk offered to assist him through notes. So, there's no interpreter available. There's the interpreters only schedule in advance. And so the clerk says, I'm sorry, we're not able to give you a sign language interpreter at this moment, but this is a simple interaction. So let's pass notes back and forth to make it possible. Well, then the resident contacts the city's ADA coordinator with a complaint. The ADA coordinator then looks into it further and they determine that finding an interpreter without advance notice is an administrative undue burden and it's unfeasible since interpreters in the area only schedule appointments in advance. And the ADA coordinator also determines that for simple transactions and interactions, such as the one that was occurring in this situation, the effective communication was provided by passing those notes back and forth, and the sign language interpreter didn't need to be contacted. But let's say it was a more complex interaction. Let's say it was an interaction where a lot of complex information is being passed back and forth. Maybe it's a longer interaction. Then the clerk may have wanted to say, let me reach out to a sign language interpreter and we'll schedule an appointment for you on this day next week, rather than passing notes back and forth. But that's an example of when something could be an undue burden, is if, there's not enough notice given. And then another exception is fundamental alteration. So again, the ADA also grants exceptions for actions that would result in a fundamental alteration. So that's, a fundamental alteration is a modification that's so significant that it alters the nature of the service, program, or activity offered. So for example, it may fundamentally alter a stage performance. Let's say you're putting on a stage performance or you're putting on some kind of public announcement in a theater or a big auditorium or at a conference center. It may fundamentally alter a performance to provide audio descriptions over a speaker. However, let's say someone does determine that it's a fundamental alteration to provide audio descriptions over a speaker to a large audience when a performance is happening, but they determine, hey, even though it's a fundamental alteration to provide those audio descriptions over a speaker, it's actually not a fundamental alteration to provide the audio descriptions through a headset that patrons who need the audio descriptions, so, maybe patrons who are blind, they can wear a headset and we can provide audio descriptions that feed into that headset. So the whole audience isn't hearing it and it doesn't fundamentally alter the performance, but those folks who need those audio descriptions can still have them. And so, what's a fundamental alteration in some instances, there may be workarounds. So just remember, if a particular aid, service, modification, or action that's requested by a person with a disability would result in these exceptions of undue burden or fundamental alteration, the entity must provide another effective aid or service if it's possible that would not result in those exceptions. So again, you can't just say, sorry, fundamental alteration, move on, you have to leave. If something would be an undue burden or fundamental alteration, you should still try your best to accommodate another way. So now let's go ahead and go back to effective communications now that we have those exceptions out of the way. So the term effective communication is defined as communication between two or more people wherein the intended message is successfully delivered, received, and understood. This means that all people included in the communication assign a similar meaning to the communication and listen to make sure everyone is heard and understood. So the reason I include this is just to say that communication doesn't stop with sending out a message. For communication to be effective, it has to be both received and understood. And the effective communication requirements under the ADA expand to companions. So companions are included when appropriate. So this could be the family member of someone, the friend of someone, or the associate of someone. And, let's say you're providing service to someone and they don't have a disability, but it's important that their companion or their friend or associate is included in that communication. And let's say that the companion, they do have a disability. Well, even though the companion isn't the one primarily receiving your services, it's important that they're clued in on the services. And so in that case, if the companion requests effective communication, they are entitled to it under the ADA. We see this a lot in, contexts of court or doctor's appointments or school meetings. Let's say that you have a student and the student is non-disabled and they don't need any kind of auxiliary aid or service to facilitate effective communication. But then let's say the student's parents are deaf. And so during parent-teacher conferences, the student's parent needs a sign language interpreter. Well, even though the parent isn't the one really receiving the primary services of the school, the student is, because the student's parent or, companion is deaf, they are entitled to effective communication, just as the student would be if they were deaf and needed a sign language interpreter. So again, we see this come up a lot in, healthcare, schools, legal settings where it's not just the person with the disability needs, the primary person needs effective communication, but also companions may need it as well. And their entities are legally obligated to provide it to companions just as they are the person receiving the service. So I have a video here just to kind of bring this to life a little bit more.
Common questions about the Americans with Disabilities Act and effective communication.
The hospital refused to provide a sign language interpreter for my dad, who is deaf, when my mother was being treated for a hip replacement surgery. Are they allowed to do that?
No, that should not have happened. A companion is anyone a covered entity would normally include in the communication process, such as a family member, friend, or associate, and should have the right to be included regardless of disability. Under the ADA, companions should also have their effective communication requests honored. For more information on the ADA and effective communication, contact us directly at 1-800-949-4232 or visit our website at rockymountainada.org.
So we know that we have to provide effective communication to people with disabilities as well as companions with disabilities. And how exactly do we go about doing this? How do we make sure that communication is effective? Well, we do so usually through the use of auxiliary aids and services. And I've been talking about auxiliary aids and services, but now I want to give some examples and explain exactly what I mean by auxiliary aids and services. So again, in order to provide equal access, a public accommodation or public entity is required to make available appropriate auxiliary aids and services when necessary or when requested to ensure that effective communication takes place. Auxiliary aids and services include a wide range of services and devices that promote effective communications. So examples of auxiliary aids and services for individuals who are blind or have low vision could include qualified readers, providing information in taped texts, audio recordings, brailled materials, large print materials for people who may have low vision, or maybe assistance in locating items. That could be a service you provide that maybe isn't normally provided, but may be provided to ensure effective communication for a patron with a disability. And furthermore, examples of auxiliary aids and services for individuals who are deaf or hard of hearing could include qualified interpreters, note takers, computer-aided transcription services, written materials, telephone handset amplifiers, assistive listening systems, telephones compatible with hearing aids, open and closed captioning, and the exchange of written notes. The list of auxiliary aids and services goes on and on. And these are just a few of the most common examples. And one of the very, very most common auxiliary aid and service is sign language interpretation. So under the ADA, qualified interpreters are able to interpret effectively, impartially, receptively, and expressively using all necessary specialized vocabulary, and they're able to maintain confidentiality. So when we're looking at all that criteria set forth by the ADA, remember that just because someone can sign does not mean they can interpret. Also, there are many different sign language systems, and that's something important to keep in mind as well, such as American Sign Language, Signed English, Swedish Sign Language, French Sign Language, and so on. And it's usually the responsibility of the entity to provide and pay for a qualified interpreter when one is requested by a person who is deaf or hard of hearing. Friends and family members of deaf and hard of hearing individuals shouldn't be relied on as interpreters by default unless all parties agree and it's appropriate in the situation. So for example, it may not always be appropriate to have a friend or a family member of a deaf individual interpret if the family member may not be able to remain impartial in their interpreting, like in a law enforcement situation. Also, minor children should never be relied on as interpreters except for in emergency situations. So in school settings a lot, we see, teachers or school administration asking students who are children to interpret for their parents, but really that's inappropriate. You should hire in an interpreter rather than relying on a child. So based on what we just learned, I have a few questions just to kind of check your knowledge. Feel free to put your answer in the chat. If you want to unmute yourself and give your answer, that's great too. Or if you just kind of want to think about it and just kind of stay put, that's totally fine too. So my first question is, can anyone who can sign be an interpreter? Yes or no? Can anyone who can sign be an interpreter? Yeah, I'm seeing a lot of no's. So, for example, a staff member who signs pretty well should not be used as an interpreter. Even though they can somewhat sign, they may not have all the skills and knowledge and specialized vocabulary to interpret, or they may use a different system of sign language altogether than the person using an interpreter. So remember that if you're bringing in an interpreter for an individual, make sure that that interpreter uses the system of sign language that the requesting individual uses. True or false, individuals can be required to bring their own interpreter. Yeah, I'm seeing some no's. So this is false. The covered entity is obligated to provide and pay for the interpreter or other kind of auxiliary aid or service when it's requested by the person with a disability. True or false, in order to avoid interpreting fees, a family member or a friend who's skilled in sign language should interpret for a person who is deaf. Yeah, I'm seeing a lot of falses, some no's. So correct, that is false. A covered entity should pay for an interpreter if one is requested and should not default to using a friend or family member to avoid paying for a qualified interpreter. Now, let's say that an individual requests that their spouse interpret and the spouse agrees. Is this okay? Seeing yes, some yeses in the chat. And that's correct. Yes, that is okay. Friends and family members can be used as interpreters as long as all parties agree, the interpreter is not a minor, and reliance on a friend or family member is appropriate under the circumstances. So remember that it may be better to hire an interpreter rather than rely on a friend or family member of a disabled individual, even if everyone agrees. It may be better to hire an interpreter if the friend or family member may not be able to remain impartial given the circumstances. So even if, a person requests that their friend or family member interpret and everyone agrees, just think about what the interaction is and think about if the friend or family member is going to be able to remain impartial. If it's just like a quick transaction, someone's paying a bill, the friend or family member is probably going to be able to interpret just fine and remain impartial. But if it's more sensitive information, then you may want to bring in kind of a neutral party to interpret. All right. So true or false, during an emergency involving imminent threat to the safety or welfare of an individual or the public, it is required that a qualified interpreter be contacted before working with anyone. True or false? Seeing some falses in the chat, and that's correct. That's false. It would be fine to utilize friends or family members or even minors if it's an emergency situation and there's no interpreter on site. However, if you can get an interpreter on site without compromising anyone's safety, by all means do that. But if it's an emergency situation, we kind of got to work with what we got. All right. So, do you have to have a qualified sign language interpreter on site at all times? Do all of your materials need to be available in Braille or audio recordings? Or do you have to have captions in every single online meeting, no matter what? The answer is no. However, if you can have certain auxiliary aids and services always available, that's great. That's awesome. Good access is always going to be good business. For example, if you're planning a very large meeting and can hire a sign language interpreter or a real-time captioner, also known as a CART provider, or C-A-R-T. Even if those services haven't been requested by a person with a disability, go ahead and do it, because you never know who's going to be in your audience, right? Again, good access is good business. However, the need for auxiliary aids and services and effective communication is usually going to be triggered by a request from an individual with a disability. So when it comes to effective communication, best practices are to provide clear, inconspicuous, clear, conspicuous information on how individuals can go about requesting effective communication, and also consider communication situations from all angles. So assess what kind of auxiliary aids and services could be needed in certain contexts, even if they're not requested, and have a plan in place for quickly providing them if needed. For example, in case of a fire, know exactly where you can go to hire a sign language interpreter to be present at a public safety announcement. And when it comes to choosing a method of effective communication, the obligations for Title II entities are a little bit different than the obligations for Title III entities. So when choosing an aid or service to facilitate effective communication, Title II entities are required to give primary consideration to the choice of aid or service requested by the person with the disability. The state or local government must honor the person's choice unless it can demonstrate that another equally effective means of communication is available, or that the use of the means chosen would result in a fundamental alteration or undue burden, like we discussed earlier. And if the choice expressed by the person with the disability would result in an undue burden or fundamental alteration, again, the public entity still has an obligation to provide an alternative aid or service that would provide effective communication if one is available. And Title III entities are encouraged to consult with the person with the disability to discuss what aid or service is appropriate. But they aren't necessarily required to honor the person's choice, although they should really try to do their best, because the ultimate goal is to provide an aid or service that will be effective given the nature of what's being communicated and the person's typical or preferred method of communicating. Covered entities may also require reasonable advance notice from people requesting aids or services based on the length of time needed to acquire the aid or service, but they may not impose excessive advance notice requirements. So walk-in requests for aids or services may not always be able to be honored, but you should still try to honor them to the extent possible. Same thing for emergencies. In those situations, make a good faith effort based on the safety and resources available. Both Title II and Title III entities are financially responsible for the cost of auxiliary aids or services, and surcharges on requesting individuals are prohibited. And covered entities may not refuse or limit an individual's access for requesting an auxiliary aid or service. So in other words, if someone requested to have a sign language interpreter present at their doctor's appointment, the doctor couldn't hike up the price of the appointment because of that request, or they couldn't, deny them service because they made that request. So let's say you do receive a request for an auxiliary aid or service. Where do you go to hire the help you need or find the help you need? Well, there's no official list of auxiliary aid and service providers, and who you hire will depend on a variety of factors such as location, costs, and availability. However, there are some resources that I have linked in the slides that can kind of get you started. So the Registry of Interpreters for the Deaf is a great resource for finding qualified interpreters for hire. The Job Accommodation Network has a list of CART service providers if you need real-time captioning, which can be great for, again, large meetings, big performances, big, public announcements, presentations, conferences, things like that. However, there's also many auxiliary aids and services you might need beyond just interpreters and captioning. And so if you fall into that situation, you can contact your local ADA center and ask for resources for specific aids and services. Or you could even check in with your other local disability organizations and groups for suggestions, such as your local centers for independent living or local disability council. In Colorado, for example, the Colorado Commission for the Deaf, Hard of Hearing, and Deafblind has an online directory of auxiliary aids and service providers or organizations that may be able to give you recommendations based on what they've used. And of course, you could always, check in with your network and put out maybe on LinkedIn an in search of message to your network, because you may be surprised who knows whom, or who's used auxiliary aids or services in the past. So oftentimes word of mouth can be the most effective way to figure out which vendor to inquire with about providing auxiliary aids and services. So now let's go ahead. Let's get into the more specifics. How can we provide effective digital communication today? How can we create accessible digital content starting today? So we're just kind of going to go through the basics of creating accessible documents, and then we're going to go through also principles of digital accessibility when it comes to social media content as well. So we're going to be talking about just the principles, the tips, the fundamentals to keep in mind when we're producing online content, whether that be outreach materials or maybe that's internal materials, emails, so on and so forth. Just the content that's digital that you're putting out into the world. Here's kind of some things to keep in mind when we're thinking about accessibility. And I will say that there's only so much we can cover. So we are just going to kind of do an overview, give you kind of the bare bones, the basics. But if you are someone who is really involved in kind of the back end processes of your digital communication, there are so many resources out there when it comes to digital accessibility. So inaccessible digital content means that people with disabilities are denied equal access to information. Inaccessible content can exclude people just as much as steps at an entrance to a physical location where a ramp is needed. As we all know, in recent years especially, many of our work lives have moved primarily online, and we rely on digital documents for internal and external business communication. Examples of this are emailing coworkers, clients, and the community, meeting through virtual platforms, disseminating digital memos and standard operating procedures, or publishing general information through online digital content. And not only that, but ensuring digital accessibility for people with disabilities is also a priority for the Department of Justice, which enforces the ADA. And you may see that there are some state and local laws emerging that are, even on top of the ADA, such as in Colorado, where I'm operating out of, that have even stricter rules for digital accessibility than what's required by the ADA. But just know that good access is good business. So digital accessibility is a great practice, whether or not it's legally required. So people with disabilities often use technology differently than non-disabled people. Digital accessibility means that people with disabilities can equally perceive, understand, navigate, and interact with a website full of valuable information. And oftentimes, in order to do that, people with disabilities need the help of assistive technology, or they use assistive technology to navigate digital spaces. So assistive technology is any item, piece of equipment, software program, or product system that's used to increase, maintain, or improve the functional capabilities of people with disabilities. Assistive technology is made up of a wide variety of types of software and hardware. Common examples include on-screen keyboards, screen readers for someone who's blind, screen magnification software for someone who has low vision, or eye tracking software for someone who has a physical disability that affects mobility. And of course, that's not an exhaustive list. Assistive technology is vast and used for many different reasons. And we don't have, the time to really dive into different kinds of assistive technology. But I will say, if you really want to go down a fascinating rabbit hole, Google assistive technology on YouTube, look at the different kinds of examples, particularly eye tracking software, because technological advancements are just so astounding, and it's quite incredible to see how someone might use technology and interact with it differently than we might. So what's important to remember is that the way we create digital content may either allow or prevent someone with a disability and or someone using assistive technology from engaging with digital content. So let's discuss some best practices to keep in mind when creating digital content to ensure that you're including as much as your audience as possible, especially when it comes to general outreach efforts. And a lot of the tips I will give you will pertain to screen readers. So screen readers, take the information that if you're a person who's sighted, that you can see on your computer or your phone or any other kind of device, and it reads it verbally so that someone who is blind is able to still receive that content. So screen readers, if you were to ask Siri to read a text to you out loud, that's kind of like a screen reader capability. So what do we need to keep in mind when we're creating digital content? When possible, use plain language. So plain language is writing designed to ensure the reader understands as quickly, easily, and completely as possible. Plain language strives to be easy to read, understand, and use. It avoids convoluted language and jargon. And plain language should be short, simple, and to the point. It should be conversational, use familiar language, and be actionable. This is going to ensure that you're reaching the most people possible by just using the words that are clear and understandable. Also, you should ensure that you're including alt text whenever you can. So assistive technology, such as screen readers, cannot infer meaning from images. If you're sighted, you're able to look at an image and kind of process it that way. But for someone who's blind, they may not be able to understand what's being portrayed in that image because they're not able to see it. So, and also assistive technology, such as screen readers, can't infer meaning from images unless alt text is added. So alt text should be brief and clearly expressed, and it should account for the context of the greater document or post, but also be cautious of automatically generated alt text, because lots of platforms will automatically generate alt text for images. And oftentimes that alt text, it can sometimes be helpful, but a lot of times it's inaccurate and just causes even more confusion for someone using a screen reader. So alt text doesn't have to be really lengthy. It doesn't have to be really detailed. Here I have an example of too much alt text for the image provided on the screen. So too much would be Belgian homemade waffles covered in blueberries and rainbow covered sprinkles on pink plates with embroidered napkins and a cup of tea with milk and a teapot all laid on hexagon white tiles. I always feel like I need to use my inhaler after I read that. Whereas, alt text that's going to be a little bit better would just be appetizing breakfast of waffles with toppings and tea. That way, someone who's using a screen reader who scrolls past that image is able to decipher what's in the image without there being too much information. And alt text should also, account for the context of the greater document or post. So just remember that if you're including a photo with information in it or text in it, or it's the photo is somehow essential to the overall understanding of the document, make sure you're including that in the alt text. Next, talking about captions. So people who are deaf or hard of hearing may rely on captions or transcripts for understanding audible content. Captions can be open, which means that they're part of the video itself. These are often referred to as hard captions or burned in captions, or captions that are overlaid on the video. They can't be turned on or off. They're part of the video in and of itself. Or captions can be closed, which means that you can have the option to have the captions on or off. And you can create SRT files, which I've linked in the slides, and that may allow you to upload, you can upload an SRT file along with a video on many platforms, and that will allow the option of closed captions. But if you're not sure, if you're not able to upload an SRT file, go ahead and include those burned in captions on a video. That way, wherever the video is distributed far and wide, it's always going to have captions included. Some platforms like YouTube, TikTok, etc., allow you to add or edit closed captions yourself, or you can outsource captions in SRT files, such as through platforms like Rev and 3Play Media, which is really easy in my experience, fairly inexpensive. So if you have a video and you want those burned in captions, you can, pass it along to these vendors like Rev, and they can do the work for you. Next, talking about color. So always ensure that color is not the only means of conveying information, and use sufficient contrast for text and background colors. So here we have a pie chart where color is the only means of portraying information. As we can see, when you view that pie chart with total color blindness, it's hard to differentiate and figure out, which piece of the pie goes with which little box on the legend. Same thing with the pie chart viewed with red blindness. Now the pieces of the pie are actually blending together. So someone who's viewing this isn't going to be able to understand the information being portrayed by the pie chart. Alternative may be using texture rather than color as a means of portraying information, or just including labels, so that no information is lost if someone is colorblind. And next, let's talk about links. So naked hyperlinks can be long and confusing for those who use screen readers. So instead of using naked hyperlinks, use descriptive text. So naked hyperlinks are a link in its purest form. It's www.rockymountainada.org/events/ Colorado / and then maybe a bunch of naked hyperlinks can get really, really long. So instead of just copying and pasting a naked hyperlink, it's best to use descriptive text. And I'll show you how to do that on Microsoft Word in just a minute. Ensure that the descriptive text describes the link's destination, because two different links that state "click here" may confuse readers. And if adding descriptive text to a link is not possible within a platform, and sometimes it's not always possible, then use a link shortener such as bit.ly, or add the naked hyperlink after the main context/text of the poster document, so that someone can still kind of understand the document, and then the naked hyperlink is the very last thing, and so they're not trying to go through a whole long link to get to the next part of the document. And when it comes to using emojis and hashtags, avoid using emojis in place of a word. When writing hashtags, it's best to use Pascal or Camel Case, as it has better screen reader compatibility. So Pascal Case means you capitalize the first letter of each word in the hashtag. In a post, if you want to use emojis and hashtags and mentions, just place them after the main content, because then again, the person who's interacting with the content with a screen reader, for example, is able to get all the main content first, and then the emojis come last, rather than the emojis kind of convoluting the main content. So here's an example of why this is important.
Window ready Gov on Twitter BRRR ellipsis it's chilly outside. Snowman if you're enduring this winter weather snowflake keep warm and dress in layers to prevent frostbite cloud with rain. Follow your local NWS office for the latest weather updates. Mobile phone with Aero find warming stations by following your local officials. https://t.co hook 3 zepxj https://t.co
So that was an example of a screen reader actually reading a tweet. And as you can tell, the emojis create a lot of confusion because they're kind of thrown in different places within the tweet. So it's hard to understand that content when it's being read by a screen reader, because there's emojis and, hashtags throughout. So if you're able to put the hashtags, emojis, and links after the main content, that's going to create the best understanding for someone using a screen reader. And then finally, talking about virtual meetings, always start meetings with a visual description. So a visual description in my case would be, my name is Tess Stanton. I'm the training administrator for the Rocky Mountain ADA Center. I am wearing a blue turtleneck. I have in gold hoop earrings. I have dark hair, dark brown hair and dark eyebrows and pretty fair skin. I'm a Caucasian woman. And I'm wearing a black headset, and I'm in front of a virtual background, which is white, and it has the Rocky Mountain ADA Center's logo, as well as a map highlighting the states in our region. And then I also have behind me kind of a watermark that says ADA, which is part of our organization's logo. So that's a visual description that helps people kind of place a voice with a name or an appearance, and especially helpful if you know that audience members are blind or low vision. And then also it's best to describe visual information throughout the meeting, especially when that information is necessary for the overall understanding of the presentation. So if an image is just decorative, you may choose to not describe it. But if you're talking about, informational pictures or charts or forms, et cetera, you want to make sure that you're describing those if you know that you have folks in your audience who are blind or low vision. If a sign language interpreter is present in your meeting, it's best to spotlight their video. That way their video never goes away when other people are talking. Use cart captioning when possible. So again, the cart captioning as opposed to automatic captioning is going to be that real-time captioning, which is usually going to, have increased accuracy. So again, if you're in a meeting where you know that someone is relying solely on captions for understanding information, you can bring in a cart provider. And actually Zoom and Microsoft Teams have the ability to kind of sync a meeting with a cart captioner and their software that they use. And so I've linked the instructions for that in the slides. It's really great technology. And then also it's just best practice to always solicit accommodation requests in advance of a virtual meeting, because you never know what someone might need and what you need to provide. And again, you may not be able to have a sign language interpreter present in every single meeting, but you want to know that if one is asked for, it's provided. So finally, to kind of round us out here, we're just going to go through the different features of Microsoft Word documents and how to make them accessible. And something I want to point out when it comes to Microsoft Word documents is a lot of the features that I'm going to be discussing can be applied across all Microsoft platforms, such as PowerPoint, Outlook, even Excel. So these tips I'm going to give you, you can apply them to other documents as well. And the reason I focus on creating accessible Word documents is because the accessibility of a document starts with its creation. And so if you create a document to be accessible in Microsoft Word, when you convert it to a PDF, it should be accessible as a PDF also. So before we dive in, I just want to make sure that I am going over the different commands or the different, tools that I'm going to be talking about and just pointing them out. So I want to make sure that everyone knows how to navigate your Microsoft ribbon. So before, before we kind of talk about like where to find what features, I want to just explain the Microsoft ribbon. So at the top of the Microsoft document generator, you'll find your ribbon. It's like your toolbox with all your buttons, your features, your commands. It contains all of your editing tools. So at the top of the ribbon are tabs. So tabs are, file, home, insert, design, layout, etc. And then under the tabs are groups. So for example, if we're in the home tab, the groups are clipboard, font, paragraph, etc. And then within those groups are commands. So the commands are the actual buttons that you push to make things happen. So commands could be, font sizing, font color, it could be italicizing, underlining, things like that. Those are the actual buttons that make things happen. Those are the commands. So first, talking about the importance of headings. So headings organize content and make finding information easier. Assistive technology cannot recognize meaning if you just format text stylistically. So in other words, if you make something a heading just by bolding it or by italicizing it or by just sizing it, for someone who's sighted, that's great. And that's, they're going to be able to recognize, oh, this is the title of the document, or this is the heading of the paragraph. But for someone who's using a screen reader, the screen reader is not going to pick up on the fact that something's italicized or something's bolded. So you have to use built-in headings in Microsoft Word, because built-in headings, if you use the built-in headings features, it adds coding to the document that will then read, a screen reader will then read it as heading 1, heading 2, etc. So heading styles create a structure that assistive technology can quickly access and aid document navigation based on heading levels. So in other words, if you're using these built-in headings, a screen reader is going to alert the user that, this is a heading 1, this is heading 2, this is the sub-content, things like that. So it makes navigation much easier. And so headings are located under the Home tab in the Styles group. And next, talking about images and the importance of alt text. So again, assistive technology such as screen readers cannot infer meaning from images or other objects like pictures, images of text, images of tables, shapes, icons, things like that. So you have to add alt text. Alt text, again, should be brief and clearly expressed and should represent the purpose and function of the image, not just describe its appearance. Microsoft Word will automatically generate alt text, but it's important that you manually check that to make sure that the alt text is accurate. So when you add an image into a Microsoft Word document, select the image, and then the alt text command will be located under the picture format tab in the accessibility group. And this will actually bring up a alt text pane on the right-hand side of the screen where you can go ahead and input your alt text into the box provided, or you can mark a text, or mark an image as decorative if it should just be skipped right over by assistive technology. So you see that little box in the alt text pane that says mark as decorative. If an image isn't really adding any meaning, if it's just purely decorative, you can mark it as decorative and it'll be skipped right over by a screen reader. Screen readers and assistive technology also cannot read information in the correct reading order when you're only using stylistic devices such as tabs or spaces to separate content into columns. So again, you have to use those built-in features because built-in features such as built-in column features will alert a screen reader that something's in a column. So column commands are located under the Layout tab in the Page Setup group. Same thing with lists. So assistive technology can't recognize that something is a list if you just format it using tabs or spaces or dashes. So you have to use those built-in list features, and many of us already use them. A bulleted list allows a user to navigate to each item in the list easily, and a bulleted list will also be identified by a screen reader and tell the user how many items are in the list. So list commands in Microsoft Word are located under the Home tab in the Paragraph group. So when it's all said and done, when you've created a document, how do you check the accessibility of your Word document? Well, there's a really handy tool in Microsoft Word. It's also in PowerPoint. It's in Excel, and it's an accessibility checker, essentially. So you can review for accessibility before converting a document to a PDF. You can check for errors in the inspection results, and if there are any errors, it'll give you recommended action. So to navigate to this tool, you want to go under the Review tab, and then in the Accessibility group, select the drop-down arrow on the Check Accessibility command. Then you'll select the Check Accessibility option, and this will bring up an accessibility pane on the right-hand side of the screen. And in the accessibility pane, it'll show you errors, and errors are things that can make it really difficult for someone using assistive technology to understand. There's going to be warnings, which warnings are things that may not be detrimental, but could create some difficulty. And then there's going to be intelligent services, so it'll alert you when that automatically generated alt text has been applied. And then in some cases, not in this example, but in some cases there may be tips, and tips are just things that, hey, you may want to add this. So this is a really helpful little tool. You can actually have that accessibility pane open the entire time you're creating a document. That way, as you're adding new content, those errors or warnings or tips are popping up in real time, and you can fix them on the spot rather than having to go back and fix everything at the end. So this is a really awesome tool for ensuring that you're upholding accessibility when you're creating these documents. And here I have a video that shows how a screen reader interacts with Microsoft Word documents. It shows an example of an accessible document versus an example of an inaccessible document. For the sake of time, we'll go ahead and skip over this video, but I have linked it in the slides, so I'd highly recommend going back because it just brings it all to life. It shows why I gave you all of those tips and what could happen if you don't follow those tips, such as if you don't use the heading style tools, or if you don't add descriptive text to a link, or if you don't, put something in a list using those built-in features, how it can read off to a screen reader and how it can create some confusion. So where can you go to learn more? Like I said, we're just kind of touching the surface of digital accessibility, but I know that you might be wondering, how do I add alt text in Facebook? How do I add alt text in Instagram? How do I make sure that captions are added to my video in YouTube? Well, the best place to start to learn more about how to create accessible content is to look within the platform itself. So many platforms offer information, guides, tutorials, and training on their accessibility features. And usually that's going to be the best place to go because the platform itself will be able to give the clearest instructions on their accessibility features. Or if you want to just more kind of overview general information, we do offer free online courses on digital accessibility that, again, are available to anyone regardless of location. And I linked those in the slides as well. So thank you so much again. I know that this was a lot of information. And again, digital accessibility can be a topic that we could be here for days or even weeks exploring, but we've just kind of, provided a starting place. Remember that accessibility takes place through incremental change, so you don't have to go back and remediate all of your documents and outreach materials tonight. It's just something that happens over time. And so just remember that a little bit of work that's continued and implemented on the day-to-day is going to have really great results. So if you are feeling overwhelmed, I completely understand. Just know that accessibility does take place through incremental changes over time. And that's the goal. A little bit is better than nothing. And again, I want to thank you so much again for being here. I hope that you were able to take away some tips and tricks just for making those outreach materials or any kind of digital materials more accessible. For our upcoming sessions on April 12th, we'll be exploring disability etiquette and inclusion and why access matters. And then on May 17th, we'll be looking into emergency preparedness and the ADA. And so with that, I want to go ahead and just provide our contact information again as promised. And we have about 10 minutes left of our training time, so I want to open the floor for questions. But if you have to hop off or if you don't have any questions or don't want to stick around for our Q&A, I want to thank you again so much for being here. It's been my pleasure to provide this information. And with that, I want to ask if anyone has any questions.